Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the Humanities Centre for the third session in our multidisciplinary investigation into the meaning and nature of the ocean. Before I say just a couple of words about today's session, I want to draw your attention to an event happening here tomorrow. See, our investigation this semester is not limited to these Tuesday discussions, and tomorrow Mark Oman, Distinguished Professor at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, will be joining us for a lecture on, this is the title of the lecture, it's a great title I think, Robotic Encounters with the Charismatic Microfauna of the World Ocean. Please join us for that. On to today's session. We've been thinking, of course, about the allure of the ocean, and last week heard from three natural scientists on how a fascination with the ocean has informed their lives and their work. Today, we turn our attention to the fields of art and literature, and I am really delighted to be able to introduce three splendid colleagues from USD's College. That was quite a laugh, from USD's College of Arts and Sciences, who will share their thoughts with us on aspects of the ocean's allure. In alphabetical order, and on my far right, this is the only time I've ever used the expression far right in relation to Jason, Dr. Jason Crum is Adjunct Assistant Professor in the Department of English. He received his BA here at USD before earning his PhD at UCSD. A specialist in modern American fiction and the graphic novel, Dr. Crum has authored papers on techno-Orientalism in US culture, Latino community agency in interwar Los Angeles radio, and objectivist poetry. As part of his contributions to the Humanities Center's Landscape and Meaning initiative, he is currently teaching the class Seascapes and the Literary Imagination, which focuses on works by Crane, Conrad, Hemingway, and others. Dr. Derrick Cartwright is Associate Professor in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History. Educated at Berkeley, UCLA, and the University of Michigan, where he earned his PhD. He subsequently held museum directorial positions at Giverny, Hanover, and Seattle, and is also currently Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Timken Museum in Balboa Park. Having taught at USD in the 1990s, he returned to us in 2012 to found and direct USD's system of galleries. Though stepping down from that role earlier this year, Dr. Cartwright still oversees the operations of the Humanities Center Gallery. His latest curatorial accomplishment, the beautiful Some Bodies exhibition, can be viewed after the close of today's event. Our third panelist today is Dr. Irene Williams, Professor of English. She received her PhD from Columbia University and is a specialist in 19th and 20th century American and European literature, with a research focus on the literary works of New England writers in the 19th century. Dr. Williams's classes at USD have focused on vital and challenging texts, such as Walt Whitman's Specimen Days, and of course of great interest to us today, Herman Melville's classic novel of the sea, Moby Dick. We should also note that this year marks Dr. Williams's 40th year at USD, and we are all truly grateful.
I'm still a young person.
Yeah. As I was saying, we are really, truly grateful for the unparalleled contributions that she has made to the life of our university. It is really lovely to have you all here with us. So please welcome Jason Crum, Derrick Cartwright, and Irene Williams.
No, I'm going to sit. Is that okay? Tell me if you can't hear me. I call this paper Melville's Ocean Refuge. Melville was 31 when he wrote the book that he titled Moby Dick or the Whale. He had been at sea on merchant ships and whalers from the time he was 20 until he was 24. In 1851, when the book was published, he was married and had started a family. He would be on land for the rest of his life. Has anyone read this book? Yes, yeah, great. The book is a curiosity, extremely long, with 135 short chapters and an epilogue. Melville concludes 30 chapters with an exclamation point. His energy punctuates the page. A spirit of excitement inflects the story all the way through. It may overwhelm readers who want their storytellers to tell the story, not get in the way of the story, not digress, not usurp the story, to cogitate on the page. Besides, the novel is not told sequentially, but rather constructed as an intricate puzzle to accommodate the author's enthusiasms. Most readers think that the human characters in any story are the story, and everything else is secondary or background. But the story of the men on board the ship Pequod is constantly being interrupted, delayed, subordinated, and even abandoned by an author who wants to talk about whales and whaling, with a different chapter for each part of a whale's anatomy: hump, nose, brain, skeleton, and more. Physiognomically regarded, Melville wrote in chapter 79, the sperm whale is an anomalous creature. He has no proper nose. It is an added grandeur. A nose to the whale would have been impertinent. So the reader recalls that the title character of the book is a whale, not a person, and that Melville will begin chapter 82, The Honor and Glory of Whaling, by saying this: there are some enterprises in which a careful disorderliness is the true method. A careful disorderliness is a fine description of Melville's strategies of literary composition. Readers never know what they will encounter when they turn the page, not because Melville has built anticipation, as with a conventionally constructed mystery story, rather because the book is not linear, but a compendium. When I was invited to this panel, I opened the book to look for passages where Melville talks about the ocean, but I found only a few about the ocean as a body of water. How would I make a paper out of that? An anecdote from my past bears on how I finally managed to make this paper. This may be instructive for my students who are here today. As an undergraduate at Bennington, I was taking a class in US intellectual history. Of course, I wanted to appear intelligent and to get an A grade, and I thought it was necessary to have an original idea to get an A. I don't remember the paper prompt, but I remember that I didn't have an original idea for responding to it. So I cheated. I stole someone else's idea and passed it off as my own. I stole the idea of a Yale professor. I knew where to look. R.W.B. Lewis had recently published the book, The American Atom, in which he described, these are his words, a radically new personality, the hero of a new adventure, an individual emancipated from history, happily bereft of ancestry, untouched and undefiled by the usual inheritances of family and race, an individual standing alone, self-reliant and self-propelling, ready to confront whatever awaited him. He was fundamentally innocent. The world and history lay all before him. Lewis identified the following US writers as bearers of this remarkable destiny: Emerson, Thoreau, Melville, Hawthorne, and Whitman, and the second half of the 19th century as the beginning of an American millennium. The anointed writers were male, white, Protestant, middle class, and upper middle class New Englanders. This insular conception of an American Adam that so enchanted me as an undergraduate no longer holds sway. The image of the American as a new man in a virgin land was self-serving and false, but it built on what was the myth of the US from its founding, the myth of the self-reliant individual who was a spokesperson for the divine. Lewis tied this myth to the writing of authors deemed canonical. The myth omitted was constructed in order to omit the indigenous, the enslaved, the indentured, the itinerant, the female, the not white, the poor, and so on. It was artfully constructed to promote conformity to a chauvinistic ideal. Now, many years later, I wouldn't steal anyone's work. As a literary scholar, I would investigate what others had written about Melville and the ocean. I would acknowledge those scholars' contributions, and I would allow myself the pleasure of querying their findings. In other words, I now find myself in a community of scholars, all of whose work taken together contributes to illuminate Melville's achievement. I don't need to be, or appear to be, or pretend to be original. Rather, I acknowledge my influences as a way of situating myself in a larger, more interesting project, as well as a way of understanding who I have become. Melville, too, was the sum of his influences, as we all are. And as we know from his passionate, eccentric book, he was someone unafraid to be himself in his work. What follows is an abbreviated selection of scholarship by others who are talking about Moby Dick and the ocean. The first, Melville and the Sea by William Hamilton, 1979. In Moby Dick, the sea appears to mean virtually everything. It has a serenity that can nearly cure Ahab's monomania. It is also darkness and death. It is, in any case, the primary symbol in Moby Dick and a clue to Melville's artistic and religious imagination. I believe that Melville, in the course of working on his masterpiece, came quite literally to worship the sea. This is William Hamilton. And I suspect it is his most distinctive theological category. It is not the weak Jesus or the evil God, but the inhuman sea that ultimately is able to solve his crisis of faith. Another writer is someone Stipe Gurgas from Zagreb, Croatia in 2016. What does Melville see in the ocean? This is this piece. My writing of the space of the sea in Melville posits it as something more than human, something that cannot be reduced to human thought or praxis. Moby Dick is a novel of the sea. Probably it is the best known example of this genre in world literature, and the number of interpretations that have read it as such about the sea is overwhelming. Concerning the manner in which Melville writes about the sea, I attach great significance to lexical practice. I have in mind his use of prefixes and suffixes. And the prefixes and suffixes to which this author refers are words like, well, I'll give you the whole word, unfathomable, infinite, immeasurable, and words ending with less, like boundless, limitless, endless. He goes on, the common denominator of these utterances is the enactment of a cognitive lack. That lack is inscribed also in instances when Melville superimposes a word referring to the terrestrial to signify the sea, such as watery pastures. In my mind, he asserts, the most important lexical evidence of this cognitive lack is landlessness. The landless highest truth, to paraphrase Melville, is nothingness itself. And the third and last selection, Reflections on the Water, the Ocean in Moby Dick, is from an MA thesis by Sarah Elizabeth Urey, submitted in 2010 to Texas State University. This is Urey. The ocean of Moby Dick is integral to the book's intricacy and ultimate success as a work of metaphysical art. The sea and its rich symbolism provide the undulating foundations of the novel. The beauty, chaos, instability, mystery, and rhythms of the ocean are among the elements that Melville reflects in his language and structure. I propose an investigation of how Melville uses the sea as a literary space in which to search for a more complete but ever elusive vision of truth. It is, in her words, a symbolic wilderness. I have been both enlightened and perplexed by these and other articles on the subject of the ocean in Moby Dick. As someone who has no interest in finding symbols in literature and who doesn't have the intellectual capacity for abstraction that might comprehend nothingness, I need to let the literary text lead me further into the text, not away from it to ideas about it. The novel opens with Ishmael, the narrating character, addressing the reader. This is Melville. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how many precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing in particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it's a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. What interests me here is that the ocean in Melville's book exists in binary with non-ocean or land. The ocean's greatest lure is that it is not the land. It is not the site of anger, instability, depression, bewilderment, sadness, confusion, frustration, or despair. It is a clarified space in which one may recover one's emotional balance and thrive. I'd like to situate this motivating sentiment in Melville's work in the literature of Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, and Hawthorne as well, and to include two other men, Poe and Douglass. I suggest that with the exception of Douglass, these men, like numerous others in their genteel milieu, were rendered profoundly uncomfortable by social and sexual conventions of middle-class culture that enforced on men a strict code of rectitude, or moral uprightness and self-suppression. Douglass, who was not white, was of course also subjected to the masculine code of rectitude double time, but he was not tormented by it. Everything about Douglass's work suggests he was a man who was at home in the world that he was vigorously committed to changing. He, Melville, and Poe were all critics of ideological whiteness, though only Douglass relentlessly exposed the atrocities perpetuated in its name. In his essay Circles, Emerson writes, "The one thing which we seek with insatiable desire is to forget ourselves, to be surprised out of our propriety, to lose our sempiternal memory, and to do something without knowing how or why." Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman all fantasized a nature, capital N nature, where one could be spontaneous. Thoreau retreated to the woods, foregoing human company. Emerson constructed an imaginary place he called the higher platform, where the universalized self was no longer husband, father, son, or brother, was indeed no longer a mere man, but had become unembodied spirit, unconstrained. I am cold because I am hot, Emerson confided to his notebook. The problem seems to have been having a body. The American Adam's body had to be rigorously managed through self-denial and self-control. This concern is transformed in Poe stories into images of putrefying flesh and the terror of being entombed alive. In Hawthorne's novel, the hero Dimmesdale mutilates his flesh in secret, and Hester Prynne renounces female embodiment to think like a man. In Moby Dick, Melville has Ishmael flee all the prohibitions and complications of life on land and abandon himself to the allure of a body of water, where on shipboard all bodies were male and the requirements of cooperative living were radically simplified. I've offered a rationale for what Ishmael is fleeing from. What then is this ocean he is fleeing toward? When I titled this paper, Melville's Ocean Refuge, I was thinking of the ocean as a shelter from danger or a hiding place, which is the etymological origin of the word refuge. Also connected etymologically is the word fugitive, for one who is on the run. But quite apart from the character's impulse to flee his life on land, the ocean itself beguiles and bewitches, tempts and enchants, provokes and summons. It exerts a power of attraction over Ishmael. It incites his enthusiasm. It coaxes him, and he surrenders to its fascination and charm. There's magic in the water that draws all men away from the land, that leads them over hills, down creeks and streams and rivers to the sea, Melville wrote in Moby Dick. And in White Jacket, an earlier book he wrote, "A snuff of the sea, my boy, is inspiration. And having been once out of sight of land, has been the making of many a true poet and the blasting of many pretenders. For do you see, there's no gammon about the ocean. It knocks the false keel right off a pretender's bows. It tells him just what he is and makes him feel it too. A sailor's life, I say, is the thing that brings us mortals out." In Melville's imagination, the ocean was a perfect antidote for pretense. Thank you. Okay.
There we go. Well, it's difficult to follow such a monumental talk about Herman Melville. You spoke, so Professor Williams spoke about how meaningful the book was to you when you were an undergraduate. I feel like I should start with saying something about Stephen Crane and how I came to know Stephen Crane. When I was an undergraduate here, one of my professors, Dennis Clausen, taught a class. He still teaches this very same class. Do you know this? Do you know this? Do you know? Oh, you in that class? Oh, that's fantastic. The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky. Professor Clausen loves that short story. And I remember reading that short story and thinking, this is amazing. This is such an amazing short story. There's got to be more to this guy. There's got to be more to Stephen Crane. And luckily there was. There's not much more, unfortunately, because Stephen Crane died in the year 1900 at the ripe old age of 28. Okay, he died of tuberculosis, unfortunately, while he was dispatched to Europe. But ever since then, ever since that class with Professor Clausen, I've always been struck by Stephen Crane, his observational, his very keen, unflinching eye to poverty, to what people are going through in whatever environment that they're in. A lot of his short stories, here's a picture of the guy right here. A lot of his short stories take place in the American West, perhaps down in Texas. Bride Comes to Yellow Sky, The Blue Hotel, or they might take place years before. During the Civil War, the Red Badge of Courage The Red Badge of Courage is his first proper novel from 1895 that took place in the American Civil War. Before that, of course, Maggie, A Girl of the Streets. This is what he's mostly known for. And he didn't have, like I said, a lot of other writings because he died when he was only 28 years old. In that span, though, of say 1893 to 1900, he left just a body of work that is just replete with just fantastic descriptions of landscapes, whether it's the Western landscapes or attempts at courage, attempts at heroism that just fall flat, or as we'll see today, his observations of life on the sea. Now, to Crane, it probably was, at least at the outset, just maybe a job. But I think that when I talk a little bit about what happened to him on one of these first voyages, we'll see that it actually became something much more monumental in his life. So Crane was the youngest of 14 children. Yes, I said 14 children. He was the youngest of 14 children to a Methodist minister in New Jersey. Okay, and he was only one of 8 that survived, sadly. He was indebted to his father by his father's sermons. Okay, these sermons that his father would give to the family or to he was an itinerant minister at the time, so he would preach in this Methodist way about salvation, about sin, but also about being saved, about baptism. And I think to Crane, the sea started off with this sense of baptism, a sense of being able to be sort of saved from the sea. This is one of his earliest poems, in fact. Okay, he didn't write a lot of poetry. This is one of his earliest pieces here from 1895, The Black Riders and Other Lines. He had just binged Emily Dickinson, he says. And if you see this, you can see maybe some Dickensian influence here. Black riders came from the sea. There was a clang and clang of spear and shield, and clash of hoof and heel, wild shouts and the wave of hair and rush upon the wind, thus the ride of sin. So it's black riders coming from the sea. It's this sense of the macabre, death coming from the sea, perhaps reaping on humans. He has some other works after this that are just very impactful. Let me just say too, I forgot to mention this. In 1896, 1897, he was dispatched to cover the Cuban Revolution against Spain and also the Greco-Turkish War for McClure's magazine. He'd written The Red Badge of Courage at the time, which was wildly successful, and it gave him essentially a carte blanche to ask for whatever he wanted for this. All right. Here's Black Riders. December 31st, 1896, something happened to Stephen Crane that was just monumental in his own life, and I think, in my estimation, changed him as a person. He departs Jacksonville, Florida, on assignment for McClure's, aboard this ramshackle schooner called the Commodore. Here's an artist's rendering of it from the first publication here. Just a couple days later, it floundered and it sank. Crane, the captain, the others on board, about 20 or so, thrown into the sea. He writes about this in his very first sort of dispatch only 4 days later. And this is really interesting for Crane because he didn't write at that speed. He's like a lot of us where it takes us, like a month to complete maybe a 5-page paper, 10-page paper presentation. So 4 days later, right, after floundering and then sort of being rescued. He writes this, Stephen Crane's own story, and it's published in McClure's magazine. It tells of exactly what happened with a reporter's eye, right? Very matter of fact, very straightforward, just a very keen eye on description, on detail. He says this, right? This is just as they're setting off before they've even left Florida. It seems, however, that there was more difficulty at the custom house. They're gathering people to leave. The officers of the ship and the Cuban leaders were detained there until a mournful twilight settled upon the St. John's, and through a heavy fog, the lights of Jacksonville blinked dimly. Then at last, the Commodore swung clear of the dock amid a tumult of goodbyes. As she turned her bow toward the distant sea, the Cubans ashore cheered and cheered. They knew this boat was going to Cuba to deliver arms. It's a filibustering boat. I'll mention that in just a second here. The Cubans ashore cheered and cheered. In response, the Commodore gave 3 long blasts of her whistle, which even to this time impressed me with their sadness. Somehow they sounded as wails, right? That will come back in the next story too, this cry of the ship that's sort of asking for some penance from the sea. He obviously didn't belong in this boat, and he says this at various places in this short dispatch. The length of this is very long. I'm not going to read the whole of it, but I will say here, he says at the end, I went to the first mate's bunk to indulge myself in all the physical delights of holding oneself in bed, just curling up in these hammocks below decks. Every time the ship lurched, I expected to be fired through a bulkhead. It was neither amusing nor instructive to see in the dim light a certain accursed valance aiming itself at the top of my stomach with every lurch of the vessel. So he's in this vessel, is in the belly of this vessel, lurching to and fro with it. It's this type of language that almost feels like it's, again, kind of like a baptismal journey, or almost as if he's been carried by a mother in this sea. At one point in the other short story I'll talk about, he calls the people that are in this lifeboat the babes of the sea, in fact. Okay, the Commodore is turned loose here. They're full steam going down to Florida. If there ever was a voice of despair and death, he says, it was the voice of this whistle. It had gained a new tone. It was as if its throat was already choked by water. And this cry on the sea at night, with the wind blowing the spray over the ship and the waves roaring over the bow, the swirling white along the decks, was to each of us probably a song of man's end. So he goes to sea as a part of a job, right? Just on this vessel, going to report on the revolution or the uprising, the brewing of dissentiment in Cuba, and immediately realizes, I don't belong here, right? He's a minister's son, Methodist minister's son from New Jersey. He had gone to a military school for high school, but didn't necessarily sail very much. Finally, it happens. This is his first dispatch of just the statement of it. The Commodore is sinking here. His ship is sinking. They're thrown into the water. The cook let go of the line. We rowed around to see if we could not get a line from the chief engineer. And all this time, mind you, there were no shrieks, no groans, but silence, silence, silence. That's very typically Cranian, I think, right there, that repetition. In the span of just like 95 to 1900, just loves these repetitious statements here. Silence, silence, silence. And then the Commodore sank. She lurched to windward, then swung afar back, righted, and dove into the sea. And the rafts were suddenly swallowed by this frightful maw of the ocean. And then by the men on the 10-foot dinghy where words said that were still not words, something far beyond words. The lighthouse of Mosquito Inlet stuck above the horizon like the point of a pin. We turned our dinghy toward the shore. This is the phrasing here is just it's very noteworthy. Then by the men on the 10-foot dinghy where words said that were still not words, something far beyond words. He takes all of this and rewrites it. And you'll notice that it's 5 months later, right? Or 6 months later. The first dispatch, just matter of factly, this is what happened 4 days later. This is June 1897. And this is published in Scribner's magazine, not in McClure's, of course, where he was under contract for his dispatches. But this short story is monumental, I think. H.G. Wells called it the finest seafaring short story he had ever read. H.G. Wells had said that, okay? The Open Boat by Stephen Crane tells us what he was thinking, but it tells us what he was thinking in that dinghy, in that boat, with absolutely no sense of the future. He starts off with a negation. I thought it was so interesting, Professor Williams, when you mentioned the language of the sea in Melville, and that it was this, it was not this, there were the prefixes, the suffixes was boundless. None of them, this is the first line, the very first lines of the open boat. None of them knew the color of the sky. None of who? What sky? What are you talking about? Steve, you're reading this short story. Their eyes glanced level and were fastened upon the waves that swept toward them. These waves were of the hue of slate, save for the tops, which were of foaming white. And all of the men knew the colors of the sea. So they don't know the color of the sky, they only know the color of the sea. The horizon narrowed and widened and dipped and rose, and at all times its edge was jagged with waves that seemed thrust up in points like rocks. That's the Western writings of Stephen Crane right there coming into it, right? And so to him, or to Stephen Crane, the ocean is essentially just like the American West. It's another landscape to be documented, to be observed, and to be written about as if it's an actual thing right in front of you, not just this romantic ideal, I think, in your mind. This is obviously it's a very long passage. I don't want to read the entirety of it, but I just want to say that this type of writing right here that he's trying to show is that everybody in the boat is experiencing the same thing, and he's realizing that it's essentially the best thing that's ever happened to him in his life, even though he's this close to death. He's at the razor's edge of death, and he's realizing it's the best thing that's ever happened to him in his life. He's writing the short story in the third person. Now, there's a correspondent in this short story, but it's written in the third person. So he, him, his, she, they. He says right here at the end of this first paragraph, right? As each salty wall of water approached, it shut all else from the view of the men in the boat. And it was not difficult to imagine that this particular wave was the final outburst of the ocean, the last effort of the grim water. There was a terrible grace. I've always loved that. I remember reading that when I was an undergrad. There was a terrible grace in the move of the waves, and they came in silence, save for the snarling of the crests. Just notice the S's there, the snarling of the crests, the move of the waves. In the wan light, the faces of the men must have been gray. Their eyes must have glinted in strange ways as they gazed steadily astern. Viewed from a balcony, this is his camera eye, right? Or his reporter's lens. Viewed from a balcony, the whole thing would doubtlessly have been weirdly picturesque. But the men in the boat had no time to see that, or to see if they had leisure, there were other things to occupy their mind. So it's very typical of Crane that we see so much analysis of the environment, but then we get this very rich internal dialogue of what these young people are, these young men, the captain, the cook, the oiler, the correspondent, and the others in the boat are going through. He says this at the conclusion, or at part of the conclusion of the short story. He says, after this, the devotion, I'm right here. After this, the devotion of the commander, the devotion to the commander of the boat, there was this comradeship that the correspondent, for instance, who had been taught to be cynical of men, knew even at that time, was the best experience of his life. But no one said it was so. No one mentioned it. So there's this silence that pervades this boat, this dinghy, as they're just waiting. They don't know if they can even get back to shore. But the correspondent here is thinking about the devotion to duty that they all have amidst this tumult of nature. The correspondent here, of course, is the one who's been taught to be cynical of men. And that's where so much of that education comes from, or it comes through in him, that he's been taught to be cynical of men, perhaps by his father's sermon, perhaps by this need to cleanse oneself, but also through his education, through his high school career, through his college career. And so he's realizing that that's not necessarily appropriate. That's not what he has to believe. That's not how he has to think. So that's what I really wanted to underscore just about the open boat here, that it's a sense of baptism for him. It's a sense that he can move from this sense of, I don't know, just the outrageousness of the sea to something that is quite beautiful. He says this at the very, very end. Pardon me, I'm going to go to the very end of this, this short story. He says this at the very end of the short story. Finally, the boat gets to sea, or I'm sorry, finally the boat gets to the coast. They go to and fro on the coast. And this is the last takeaway that Crane has from this event that's happened to him. He says, it seems that instantly the beach was populated with men with blankets, clothes, and flasks, and women with coffee pots and all the remedies sacred to their minds. The welcome of the land to the men from the sea was warm and generous, but a still and dripping shape was carried slowly up the beach, and the land's welcome for it could only be the different and sinister hospitality of the grave. The cook, the captain, and the correspondent make it to shore. The oiler does not. This man is named Billy. He doesn't make it. Crane is moved by this because the oiler, Billy, had been doing all of the rowing. He's the engineer. He's the only one that really sort of was able physically to just manifest that tumultuous waves, the effort. And he writes this at the end here, and I think this is what he really means. This is where I got the title of my talk from, The Great Sea's Voice. When it came night, the waves paced to and fro in the moonlight, and the wind brought the sound of the great sea's voice to the men on shore, and they felt that they could then be interpreters. And that's, I think, what Stephen Crane was really trying to get at. This sense that we go through the tumult, we go through these horrible events, these very trying events, and there's no heroism there necessarily. There's just being. There's just a sense of movement. But he mixes that in with these discoveries about himself, about the men on the ship, and about his place in and amongst nature. He's known very much for his realism, his naturalism, which we won't necessarily get into right now. He was there. I just want to close the talk just by mentioning what he was doing there to begin with, because it's worth saying. He was filibustering. And that's not the way we talk about filibustering today in American politics. We start thinking, well, should we take away the filibuster from the Senate? No. Filibustering was essentially you're a brigand. Filibustering was a sort of a way that certain individuals, certain people of means, certain captains, certain people just wanted to go start up trouble, would chart a ship, buy a boat, buy some weapons, some arms, and go to a different place and just start some trouble. Now, this was outlawed by the U.S. government in the late 1800s. It didn't stop a lot of it from happening. And that's what he was doing. He was on a filibustering boat. The Commodore essentially was a filibustering boat. He was not himself a filibusterer, but he was on this ship that was filibustering. What would happen was some of these individuals would purchase these weapons, these arms, go to places like Cuba, Panama, Puerto Rico, and sort of distribute these weapons, these arms, and sort of rise up a rebellion or start trouble with. He takes this and turns it into a different short story, right? This is the last thing I'll mention about him. He takes this one event where he was on this filibustering boat, where he knows he doesn't belong there. He takes this one event of being tossed into the water, finally being rescued a few days later, and he writes immediately this dispatch, the Stephen Crane's short story, and then 5 months later he writes The Open Boat from the correspondent's perspective. Even though it's a third-person narrative, it really is in the correspondent's point of view. And then shortly after that, I think in about, it must have been September, October of 1897, he rewrites it from the captain's point of view. And this one is even more full of just sort of a great sort of pathos, right? It's very, very sad to read this one. Open Boat is very much a voyage of discovering the self amongst the tumult of the sea, right? But he says here, right, in this the short piece, Flanagan, he says, this steamer had about her a quality of unholy medieval disrepair, which is usually accounted the principal prerogative of the United States Revenue Marine, that is to say the merchant marines at the time. There's many a seaworthy ice house, if she was a good ship, that is to say she was not a good ship. She swashed through the seas as genially as an old wooden clock, burying her head under waves They came only like children at play. And on board, it cost a ducking to go from anywhere to anywhere. He says this at the very end of it. Finally, the ship sinks, and he tells this from the captain's perspective here. He calls it the wretched foundling at the end of this. He says, one sat near the foot of the companion, his face hidden in his arms. One leaned against the side. This is the sort of the pathos, the sadness of you see in the captain's face. One leaned against the side and gazed at the snarling water as it rose in its mad eddies among the machinery. In the unholy red light and gray mist of this stifling dim inferno, they were strange figures with their silence and their immobility. The wretched foundling groaned deeply as she lifted and groaned deeply as she sank into the trough, while hurried waves then thundered over her with the noise of landslides. So again, we see in these last couple of passages the sense of the unholy or the demonic, some sense of that from his father's influence. But we also see the noise of landslides, which is very typically Crane looking into the American West. Okay. He goes on a little bit later in 1897 to be dispatched to Greece, and he reports from Athens on the Greco-Turkish War. And I'll just end with this to say that to Stephen Crane, it wasn't just about transportation; it was about transformation, transformation of the individual. I think. I started my talk by saying he had very unromantic ideals of heroism. Unromantic ideals of war, what it really does to a person, even though he had never seen the Civil War. He had talked with people. As a correspondent, he had talked with survivors, and he listened to them. Here he is dispatched to Greece and reporting on the Greco-Turkish War. I just want to read these just to conclude, just to see how it comes full circle with Crane and his ideals. He says, near the hatch where I can see them is a man shot through the mouth. He's on a hospital ship here in the Gulf. The bullet passed through both cheeks. He's asleep with his head pillowed on the bosom of a dead comrade. He'd been awake for days, doubtless, marching on bread and water, to be finally wounded at Demokos and taken aboard this steamer. He is too weary to mind either his wound or his awful pillow. There's a breeze on the Gulf, and the ship is rolling, heaving one wounded man against the other. So again, it's this brotherhood, this comradeship that he sees, that the ship is again holding them. We went ashore after some trouble, a little bit later in this dispatch. We went ashore and after some trouble found the soldier. He was ill with fever, was shot through the calf of the leg, and his knees were raw from kneeling in the trenches. We added him to our list of wounded and then steamed away for Chalkis. There is more of this sort of thing in war than glory and heroic death, flags, banners, shouting in victory. That can very well be taken directly from the Red Badge of Courage. That's exactly how that novel ends. Sadly, he died just a few years later, 1900, when he was dispatched. He died in England of tuberculosis again. So tragic life cut short. But in the meantime, just in the span of really about 10 years, he just left this body of work that is just, I think it's just absolutely wonderful. I really do think that his descriptions of the ocean, the way that it affects him as an individual, and this sense of humanity that he gets from it, it's truly sublime, I think. So, all right, that's Stephen Crane for you. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to my talk.
While I fumble around, I want to start by thanking Brian and Lindy for inviting me to give this talk. It's always great to be part of programs here, and also for pairing me with such wonderful colleagues. I'm going to begin by trying to impersonate an English professor. Read a poem by Robert Lowell called Castine, 1860. It goes like this. One misses Emerson, drowned in luminism, his vast serenity of emptiness, and Fitzhugh Lane painting a ship moored in Castine, within shouting distance of my barn in 1860. its bright fly wings fixed in the topographical severity of a world reworked as glass. Tools are honestly made and often jails. The horror of top flight skyscraper villages is the stench of loneliness they give off. Elemental material, line to line to line. The skeletal trinity of Thomas Aquinas. One should take a notebook into jail. Nothing is real until it is set down in words. We are ice returning to water. That's a somewhat obscure poem by Lowell from a book, this book, Notebook, about Castine, which is my main subject today. And this is a picture of Lowell with his daughter Harriet, taken in 1960 in Castine. So he mentions a bunch of things in that poem that I think circulate around my talk today. He mentions Emerson and his emptiness. He mentions Luminism, which was this art movement that was being described at the time by a bunch of professors at Harvard as typifying American art of the kind I'm showing you here by Fitzhenry Lane, which very still views of the northern New England coast. And so I'm impressed actually by the degree to which Lowell is aware of a lot of the current debates in my field of art history and how conversant he is and how willing he is to put them into a poem. I'm sort of just taken back by that, especially since he reads Lane in a way that I don't think very many other people have successfully read him. I need to say that in talking about Castine, Maine, I'm talking about a place that's as geographically far from where we are tonight as I could possibly be conjuring in this. In fact, if we left right now in our cars, we could get there by about Friday without stopping. It's, so it's roughly, I guess you could be in Presque Isle or someplace, or maybe Mount Desert or something like that, maybe a little bit further, but it's far from us. And so I want to bring it here to the degree that I can and make it present for you. I'm interested in sort of mapping also a small distance between the work that Fitzhenry Lane creates in Castine, Maine, and that's the painting that's here in San Diego at the Timken Museum of Art, a painting called Castine Harbor and Town, painted in 1851, and the much better known work of somebody like Winslow Homer, who is maybe the great painter of the American maritime environment. And so it strikes me that these are, we could talk about this maybe, and that would be it for this talk, about the difference between Lane's framing of that coastal landscape, where he gives you this nice, comfortable and serene, that's what Lowell says anyway, the serene view of this place, and Homer's where a rogue wave will take us and we're lost. And this happens over a very short period of time, 40, 50 years. And it seems to me that the crisis of the Civil War is something that informs this transition in American maritime art, but that's not enough to fully explain it. And so there's something about the approach of these two artists that interests me a great deal and that I want to share with you today. So Fitzhenry Lane, you'll notice that Lowell calls him Fitzhugh Lane, and for a long time, that's what scholars in my field thought his name was, but it actually wasn't. In fact, his real name was Nathaniel Lane, but there was another Nathaniel. Anyway, this is a long rabbit hole. We're not going to go down it together, but Fitzhenry Lane was the preeminent maritime painter in the United States in the mid-century and produced hundreds of works. In fact, if you have time, you should just look at the Cape Ann Museum's Fitzhenry Lane archive, which basically is this effort to catalog everything he ever did, as well as to locate it geographically. It's really a fantastic resource. There's only a couple of images of Lane. He was a very frail person. I'll say something more about that. This is, I'm realizing now, a very bad reproduction of his only self-portrait that he did. But mostly he painted the sea, which is why I think Brian asked me to give this talk. So he's painting the sea, but always from particular vantages. And in fact, he's mostly interested in this place that I'm interested in too, Castine, Maine, which, while it's very far from us, was even far from where Lane lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And it was an important place because it had been settled first by the Dutch and then the French, and it had been the object of a really important naval battle in the Revolutionary War. It had changed hands many times in this way, and it's today, it was in Lane's time and is still today, this resort community, which is really worth a visit if any of you ever find yourselves in that part of the Down East. It's absolutely beautiful. And Lane probably produced about 20 paintings of Castine and probably a similar number of drawings and one lithograph of the place. And I want to look at why that was with you. It's an inauspicious place in some ways, but even in the mid-19th century, it had its own bustling industry, building ships to move the lumber, which seemed to be limitless from Maine, out to the ports of Boston and places like that. So it was a really sophisticated place, as you could find in that part of New England. This is actually Fort George, where the Revolutionary Battle took place. And these maps give you a sense of the topography, the topographical severity, which Lowell talks about, but in less precise terms than Lane was able to render. And it's been said about scholars who know a lot more about Lane than I do, that this was not an easy subject for him to paint because it's a small town stretched out over a long peninsula with no prominent landmarks, but Lane managed somehow to give it a kind of integrity and to capture a sense of this place for audiences. And I want to talk about the specific audiences that this painting appealed to, because some of you know the work of Arjun Padurai and his idea of the social life of things. I think this painting is a great example of the kind of object biographies that Padurai and others have talked about. And its travels actually have a lot to teach us because it somehow caught, and I'm convinced of this, it caught Lowell's eye and it catches our eye today for different reasons. So this is Castine in maps of the town, and also one of these drawings which Lane produced. And I want to argue against what Sharp said, that it's not this neutral place. It actually, everything that Lane depicted in that painting had a purpose. So when he went to Castine, he was a house guest of family friend in Gloucester, and he's mapping out the town according to that place where he was located. And so it shows up on the maps, and it is a big part of Lane's own layout of that scene. He was there because his good friend, Joseph Stevens, invited him there for summers, about 6 or 7 summers between 1850 and 1865, when Lane died. He would go to Castine in the summertime and sort of enjoy all the hospitality that the Stevens family could offer him. And they recorded his visits. He was very close, not just to Joseph Jr., but to his parents and to his sister. And they understood that he was doing something there. It's important that they took on Lane as an almost family project. Lane was born with childhood paralysis, and so he had difficulty moving. He walked his entire life with crutches. And so boat travel for Lane was a much better means of conveyance than any other form of conveyance that he could have. And so even to travel from Gloucester to Castine, which takes you about 5 hours by car today, would have been a multi-day journey, except by boat. And so Lane, who goes there from his home in Gloucester, is actually taking advantage of the Stevens's relationships within the shipping community when he goes there. I'm just showing you the house that still exists. It's in the center of a park in Cape Ann, which Lane lived in, and the monument to Lane, which is in that same park. And you can see the crutches that the modern sculptor has made to sort of give some visibility to that paralysis. And you can also see the kinds of works that Lane was known for when he painted the Gloucester Harbor, which was literally outside of his door. So he spent a lifetime painting that scene. And when he goes to Castine, he's doing something slightly different. I want to argue that he's looking back from the water to the village as opposed to out to sea. And the Stevenses were crucial to this. You have to imagine, to get to this hill looking above the town of Castine, they have to help him there. And he almost acknowledges this in the way these works are attributed. It says F.H. Lane, Joseph L. Stevens, Joseph L. Stevens Jr. They are collaborating on the creation of these works. And he's using something that we call camera lucida. So he's looking through a prism, both out at the landscape and down at the sheet of paper, and he's copying it in an almost mechanical way. So he's getting this truly topographical survey of this land. Every tree, every building would have been in correspondence to perceive reality in these works. And he produces, as I said, dozens of these drawings looking out across Penobscot Bay, beginning in 1850. So this is the first year he goes there. And the Stevenses, as I say, are making him feel as welcome as possible so that he can capture this place that they know and love so well. And these are other various views. I'm not going to spend a long time on them, but give you a sense of how this place was laid out and the kinds of things from land that Lane is interested in as he's spending his summers there. And then he has this idea that he's going to make this commercial product out of these summer visits. So he is going to make a lithograph, and he was trained as a lithographer in Boston. And so he does this long view of Castine from Hospital Island, and he signs up people to subscribe to it. So in the way that you subscribe to Netflix, you could get this print coming to you in your mailbox at some point if you had paid in advance to have Lane do this. So he's already sold it out before he actually ever puts the ink on the stone. And that's one of his main goals, is to turn this into something lucrative. But I'm actually interested in the non-lucrative side of what he's doing, or at least the stuff that he does to the side of that. So I'm going to start talking about this large, it's big watercolor at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And it shows Castine from that view across part of Penobscot Bay and this narrow channel, and shows you the Stevens's house, the town square, all of these things that so absorbed Castine, made Castine absorbing for Lane at this moment. And I just want to show you that this watercolor maps perfectly onto the painting here in San Diego. So I've tried to show you this in various, it's not perfectly, in that he's added some things. I want to talk about that in a moment, but Lane is so careful to make sure that what he's giving us when he transcribes that watercolor to the canvas is faithful to the place itself, that it's going to be a revealing transcription. But what he changes, I want to say, is really important. I'm going to read you, or maybe you can read for yourself, the inscription that was added much later to the top of this watercolor. It says, Castine Harbor and Town, which is the name of the painting, from American Battery of 1779 at Haney's Point, a short way northerly of Henry's Point at a later time, and Fitzhenry Land, not his name, again, of Gloucester, Mass, made this sketch for Noah Brooks in August 1851, and on its acceptance, an oil painting. In his will of November 30th, 1900, Mr. Brooks bequeathed the painting to the town of Castine for the public library. And so again, I'm interested in following the biography of this work as it moves from Lane's sketchpad into public spaces. But before I do that, I just want to point out that there's nothing accidental in this painting. So in 1851, the year that he paints it in the Castine boatyard, they're building this ship, which appears in the painting. It's actually not an insignificant ship. It was a major commercial vessel, which would have been, one of the points of pride of this town, actually named after one of the town's founders, George Witherley, or maybe this is the William Witherley, but commissioned by his son, George. So everything is placed there for a reason, as if Lane knows that Noah Brooks is going to understand all these elements to the painting. He even includes the Stevens family boat in the painting. And so here you see this sketch that he does of the boat, and then I think it's the same boat here, or at least you can bear with me if I imagine this. That's Lane and Stevens sailing away just above Lane's signature in this thing. So I would say it's both topographically accurate and this fantasy he has of what Castine means. So this photograph shows you where the painting ended up first, in the library of Noah Brooks. Does anybody know who Noah Brooks was? Could. It's not out of the question that you would, but in any case, he was born in Castine. He was a journalist, a little bit like Crane. He was Lincoln's first biographer. That's what he's best known for being. And he commissioned this painting because he wanted to carry it with him everywhere he went after he left Castine. As a journalist, he would sign, as many 19th century journalists did, pseudonymously his text Castine. That's how you knew it was Noah Brooks. And so the painting meant something to him. There it is on the wall of the library. So it had this talismanic presence in his life, and this is his library late in life. He actually died in Pasadena, California, because he was trying to get to a warm place, which I guess Castine isn't very often. But this is actually a photograph, I haven't figured this out yet, back at his home called Noah's Ark in Castine. And this is just to give you an idea of who Noah Brooks was. As I mentioned, he's writing all these children's books as well as Lincoln's biography. He was a confidant of Lincoln, and the two had a private correspondence in addition to his public role as a journalist covering his presidency. And he's, as this quote suggests, he was something of a professional failure in many ways, but he had this painting that he loved and that he carried with him everywhere. And it strikes me that it's a meaningful thing. I found this photograph when I was at the Castine Historical Society, which is so great. It's Noah Brooks at his desk with, that's the painting in the corner, in slightly different arrangement in that room. And when, after he died in Pasadena, he asked to have his body taken back to Castine so he could be buried there with the rest of his family. So I just throw that out there as proof of the importance of this work within the life of the person who paid for it. And at his death, as that inscription tells you, he donated it to the Castine Library, actually the Witherley Public Library, which is one of the oldest public libraries in the state of Maine. Still looks a lot like it does in this postcard. I think they've added a wing to it, but it's named after the town's chandler, the merchant who really made his fortune selling to all these sailors, George Witherley. And he gave the land for this and built the library. And one of the first objects it acquired was Brooks's painting by Lane. This is actually important because Lane is there to be seen by Robert Lowell, who lived in a house 2 doors down from that library and who spent his summers. He had inherited this house from his, I think either his aunt or his cousin, Harriet Winslow. And so he went there. And so when Lowell writes about this landscape, he's thinking about these paintings that Lane produces, which are, for us today, these calming evocations of a kind of pre-Civil War beauty to the American landscape. But I want to argue they were actually something completely different for the people who experienced it. This was a sign of industrial power in Maine at the time. So to have a lumber schooner of that size parked outside your town meant that you were making money. And we read these paintings very differently today. I think Lowell reads them differently, but these are signs of economic clout and power. And Lane was mastering that, even as he was putting it into this, I'm going to use Lowell's term, this kind of Emersonian nature and kind of transparent eyeball view of the world. They meant something very different to the people who consumed them. And they meant something different from what Winslow Homer suggests they meant. So Homer, who succeeds Lane, as I said, as the most important American maritime painter, has a very different conception of what the relationship of humans to the sea is going to be. He's thinking the sea is a terrible, terrifying place, and it's going to take you. And if you don't understand what he means by that, this is a picture, maybe one of his great paintings called The Fog Warning. And what we see is this fisherman in the Down East in this boat laden with this huge catch that he's bringing in. And the boat that he needs to get back to is disappearing into the fog. If it disappears into the fog, he's dead. Fishermen in New England at this time never learned how to swim, so they would drown quickly. And he knows if he does not get to that boat within, I don't know, and then Homer poses the question for all of us, is he going to make it? And so we all have to consider for ourselves, is that a distance you can close, rowing as hard as you can? Sort of like the boiler in Crane's story. Is he going to make it? And in most cases in this painting and in others like the Gulf Stream, Homer sort of puts it out there that he's not going to make it. And so we have to sort of wrestle with the cruelty of the sea. And I say that that's a shift that takes place in American culture that I can't actually fully address in this talk, but it's worth remarking upon because it's completely different. And as this earlier text suggests, you know, he is about to be left in measureless void, right? So I think about all of your lesson the suffixes and others. This measureless void is how the sea is registered for Winslow Homer. And that's not part of Lane's worldview at all. So I'm going to close as I began with another poem by Robert Lowell, because I know you're really interested to hear another one, also called Castine Harbor. And it strikes me that it's a nice coda to this talk. It says, mostly it's a color. Its change and yield give easily no stand except the headland, one substance, everywhere divisible, bosom of salt. It floats us, less and less usable now. We can fly like the angels. Yet who would stay alive without the ocean? 2 parts hydrogen nagging for oxygen, as if the formula existed everywhere in the numinous Parnassus of chemistry. The statesman mutters, the problems of politics are nothing. He was thinking of his marriage, habitual, changing. The sea is a marriage. God is H2O, who must forgive us for having lived.
Actually,
Yes.
Please. I was going to ask, kind of going off that like, idea of, but how do you feel about the endlessness slash like kind of what you were bringing up, like how writers put into words the feeling of weightlessness slash, you know, all these suffixes and prefixes of the ocean being this void, this nothingness, informing like other genres. Like I know Lovecraft was writing at the time about he was informed by the ocean a lot in the sense how it informed like hospital other genres. And it's not just it's this like play of nature informing like this need that people have to like explain the nothingness.
You're looking at me, Tom, but I don't really know how to answer. Maybe others?
I don't know either. I don't know how to field that.
They're right at the same time as Crane.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because it's like the birth of a new genre from like this understanding of how Crane's writing of just the ocean in a certain way, like this kind of death of the West, like explaining like something that people were aspiring to, and then the horror of meeting it finally, where it's
Yeah. Well, Crane, the allure, since it's called the allure to Stephen Crane, again, was a job. It was money. And those are the dispatches. The creative side of him, I think, wanted to show how both the void, the snarling crest of the wave, the sort of what seems to be kind of an animalistic, it's lapping at your feet. It's about to grab you and drag you down. He wanted to show how that changed him as a person, I think. And it did. It really did, I think. That would be my approach to that. That's a great question. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that briefly, in the way we're both engaging at home, we're engaging with the ocean. We're engaging with the ocean sort of under their own terms. Crane, on the other hand, had no intention of engaging with the ocean. The ocean engaged with him in a way that was completely private.
Yeah. Yeah.
And his response to that may have been very, very different because he wasn't even thinking about it. He wasn't trying to contextualize the ocean, but he was forced to because he was dumped.
Yeah, quite literally just dumped it. Yeah, jumped overboard. Yeah. He says at one point in the open boat, when it occurs to a person that this is, that this might be their very last, their last hurrah, their last moment, they try to make peace with the temple. He's referencing a religious temple. And he says, then this person looks around and realizes that there are no temples. There's no temple erected to nature, which you could appeal to. And he says eventually you come to this idea that there is nature in the wind, but then nature in the mind. So nature as it is, but then nature the way we think of it. I'm going to go commune with nature. Let's go for a hike. And we'll, we have these notions of nature as being benevolent or very placid, very peaceful, and it can be, it is, but not always. And so finally he comes to the conclusion in this very important part of the story. He says that, but ultimately she was indifferent, flatly indifferent. She was not treacherous, nor wise, nor beneficent. She just was. So to the plight of this person tossed into the soup, she was indifferent, really. So I think that's actually a fantastic. Thank you for offering that. I think that's a fantastic distinction of going into the water, going into the sea, the allure of the sea by choice, versus just being tossed into it.
Just close things off here. First of all, next week, so we've had 2 sessions on the allure. Next week it's the lure. It's the law and then the law. Next week it's exploration. Biggest thank you. Truly, truly